The morning they blocked my driveway, I remember thinking how ordinary everything felt. The sky was clear, the air cool, birds chirping like nothing in the world could possibly go wrong. I had just poured my first cup of coffee when I noticed the bright orange cones at the end of my driveway. At first, I thought it was some utility work. Maybe a cable repair or road patching. But when I stepped outside, I saw folding tables, banners, and volunteers setting up decorations across the street. The HOA was hosting a community charity fair. And they had decided my driveway was the perfect place to block off for extra space. A volunteer in a neon vest smiled at me cheerfully. "Sorry. Just for today. We need the space for foot traffic and vendor tents." I stared at him, confused. "You can't block this. This is my only vehicle access." He pointed casually toward the street. "You can park over there for now." Over there was 2 blocks away. I explained calmly that emergency vehicles sometimes needed direct access to my home. I lived alone, and my father's medical equipment was stored inside because he stayed with me often. Paramedics had come before. Fire services too, during a small electrical incident last year. The volunteer shrugged. "The board approved it? It's just for a few hours." That sentence should have made me more uncomfortable than it did. I called the HOA office. No answer. I sent emails. No response. I even walked over to the event coordinator, who was busy directing vendors. She barely listened. "We sent a notice last week. It's community participation. Please be cooperative." There was no notice in my mailbox. I felt a quiet unease settle in my chest, but I told myself it wasn't worth a fight. It was just a day. Just an event. Just some cones. So I went back inside. I didn't know that those cones would become the reason sirens would echo down our street only hours later. And that people would realize too late why blocking a driveway is not a small inconvenience. It's a life-threatening mistake. Because at 2:17 p.m., smoke would start pouring from the side window of my house. And a fire truck would turn into our street with nowhere to go. By early afternoon, the music from the fair had grown louder, drifting through my windows in uneven waves. Children laughed, vendors shouted promotions, and someone tested a microphone again and again. I tried to ignore it and focus on some paperwork at my dining table. But an uneasy feeling kept distracting me. I kept glancing toward the driveway through the curtains. The cones stood there like silent warnings I didn't fully understand yet. At exactly 2:17 p.m., I smelled something strange. A sharp, bitter scent that didn't belong in a quiet home. I froze for a moment, trying to place it. Then I saw the faint gray thread of smoke curling past the hallway ceiling. My heart slammed hard against my ribs. The electrical outlet near the storage room had sparked. A box stored too close had caught fire. Flames were already licking the curtains beside it. I grabbed my phone and dialed emergency services with shaking hands. My voice trembled as I gave my address. They told me to get outside immediately. I stepped into the yard, coughing, watching smoke thicken inside my windows. Neighbors began noticing and shouting from across the street. Someone yelled that the fire truck was on the way. I felt a brief wave of relief. Then the sirens grew louder, echoing through the neighborhood. They turned onto our street and slowed. I watched their hesitation from the sidewalk. The driver leaned out, staring at the sea of tents, people, and block space. He tried to edge forward but stopped again. There was simply no direct access to my driveway. Volunteers scrambled, confused, moving tables too slowly. Every second felt stretched and heavy. Smoke poured thicker from my window, turning darker. I could hear crackling from inside now. The firefighters shouted for people to clear a path immediately. But the crowd didn't understand the urgency at first. This was supposed to be a cheerful community afternoon. Not a race against spreading flames. I realized, with sinking dread, that those orange cones were now costing precious time. And time is the one thing fire never gives back. The heat began pressing against my face even from outside. I stepped farther into the street as ash floated past me. People finally started dragging tents aside in panic. The fire truck crawled forward inch by inch. A firefighter jumped down before it fully stopped. He pulled the hose while shouting directions to others. I watched, helpless, knowing this delay never had to happen. All because someone thought a driveway was just empty space. I whispered a quiet apology to my home, hoping the damage would be limited and that the firefighters could still save what mattered most inside those smoke-filled walls today. The first blast of water hit my front window with a force that made the glass shudder in its frame. Firefighters moved with urgent precision, their boots splashing through puddles forming on the pavement as hoses snaked across the street. I stood behind the yellow tape they had quickly stretched between two poles, my hands trembling, my throat raw from smoke and fear. Neighbors gathered in clusters, whispering in disbelief. The cheerful music from the fair had stopped completely. In its place was the relentless hiss of water meeting flame. A firefighter shouted that the fire had spread into the hallway ceiling. Another called for additional ventilation. I could see them through the smoke, silhouettes moving through my front door like shadows in a storm. Every second felt painfully slow. I kept thinking about the storage room where the fire began. The extension cords. The old heater I had meant to replace. The things we always postpone because life feels busy and ordinary. But nothing about this felt ordinary anymore. I glanced toward the HOA volunteers. They stood off to the side, their earlier confidence gone. The woman who had dismissed me in the morning now looked pale, clutching her clipboard like it could somehow shield her from responsibility. People were staring at her. Some with confusion. Others with anger. The orange cones had been tossed aside, crushed under hurried footsteps. One firefighter finally emerged from the house, lifting his mask. His face was streaked with soot. He walked straight toward me. "Are you the homeowner?" I nodded, barely able to speak. "You're lucky you called when you did. Another 10 minutes and this would have reached the roof structure. We've got it contained, but there's significant damage." Lucky. The word echoed strangely in my mind. Lucky that the fire didn't spread faster. Lucky that I was home. Lucky that they eventually got through. But all I could think was how much faster they could have reached my door if my driveway had been clear. If those cones had never been there. As smoke continued drifting into the sky, I noticed people filming on their phones. Some recording the firefighters. Others recording the blocked driveway, the scattered tents, the chaos that had unfolded. It felt surreal, like my private disaster had turned into a public lesson unfolding in real time. The HOA event banners fluttered in the breeze, half collapsed now, as if even they were ashamed to be standing there. And for the first time since morning, I felt something shift inside me. This wasn't just an accident anymore. This was negligence. The fire was officially declared under control at 3:02 p.m. Steam rose from my roof in slow, ghost-like waves as firefighters rolled their hoses back toward the truck. The street smelled of wet ash and melted plastic. My home, the place that had felt so calm that morning, now looked wounded and unfamiliar. Black streaks framed the windows. The front door hung open, charred along its edges. A fire officer approached me with a clipboard and a steady, practiced tone. He asked routine questions first: where the fire started, whether anyone else was inside, if I had insurance. Then his eyes drifted past me toward the street, to the tents being dismantled in awkward silence. "Was access always this blocked?" he asked. I swallowed. "They set it up this morning for an event. I told them emergency vehicles might need the driveway." He looked back at the cones lying crushed near the curb. His jaw tightened slightly. He wrote something down. "That delay mattered," he said quietly. We lost critical minutes navigating around that setup. Those words landed heavier than anything else that day. Critical minutes. I turned and saw the event coordinator speaking rapidly on her phone, pacing in tight circles. 2 HOA board members had arrived and were surveying the damage with expressions that mixed concern with calculation. They weren't looking at my house. They were looking at the scene like it was a problem to be managed. A few neighbors came over to check on me. One of them, Mr. Hanley from across the street, shook his head. "You warned them this morning." "I heard you." "They brushed you off." Others nodded in agreement. Witnesses. I hadn't even thought about that yet. A firefighter handed me a plastic bag containing my house keys, now coated in soot. "You can't go back in until inspection clears it," he said gently. I stood there holding those blackened keys, realizing I had nowhere immediate to go. The fair had been cancelled. The street was slowly emptying. What remained was the uncomfortable awareness that something preventable had just happened in full view of dozens of people. The HOA president finally walked toward me. His voice was careful, rehearsed. "We're very sorry this happened. We had no way of knowing." I stopped him. "I told you this morning." He paused, clearly not expecting that. "And I emailed. And called." Silence stretched between us. Behind him, someone was still filming. For the first time, I saw worry replace authority on his face. By late afternoon, the crowd had disappeared, leaving the street strangely quiet. Bits of trash from the cancelled fair rolled along the curb in the breeze: paper cups, flyers, a fallen banner tangled around a folding chair. My house stood dark and damp, windows open to let smoke escape. Every now and then, a faint drip of water echoed from inside. I sat on the curb with a borrowed bottle of water, trying to steady my thoughts. My phone buzzed constantly with messages from neighbors asking if I was safe. A few of them sent videos they had recorded when the fire truck struggled to get through. Watching those clips made my stomach tighten. You could hear the sirens, the confusion, people shouting to move things out of the way. You could see the cones. You could see the blocked driveway. Mr. Hanley sat beside me. "You should keep those videos," he said quietly. "This wasn't just bad luck." I nodded, realizing the situation was slowly shifting from shock to clarity. What happened wasn't simply a house fire. It was a chain of decisions that began with someone dismissing a basic safety concern. The HOA president returned, this time with another board member and softer expressions. "We'd like to help with immediate arrangements," he offered. "A hotel for a few nights, perhaps." I looked at him, exhausted. "I don't need a hotel. I need acknowledgement that this should never have happened." He hesitated. "We followed event procedures." "That doesn't include blocking emergency access," I replied. He didn't argue. As the sun dipped lower, an insurance representative called me back. I explained everything carefully, including the blocked driveway and the delayed fire response. There was a long pause on the line before the agent said, "Please document all of that in writing. That detail is important." Important. That word again. By evening, a fire inspector returned briefly to tape a notice on my door. "Unsafe to enter until further review." I watched him work under the fading light and felt the weight of the day settle over me. My home wasn't just damaged by flames. It had been compromised by preventable negligence. Across the street, volunteers loaded the last of the event supplies into a van without speaking. No music. No laughter. Just quiet. And in that quiet, I realized something: this story wasn't over when the fire went out. It was just beginning. I spent that night at a neighbor's house, lying awake on a couch that felt both generous and unfamiliar. Every time I closed my eyes, I heard the sirens again. I saw the fire truck inching forward. I smelled the smoke. Sleep came in short, restless bursts that left me more tired than before. By morning, the shock had settled into something sharper focus. I walked back to my house just after sunrise. The street looked normal again, almost disturbingly so. No tents. No cones. No sign that chaos had unfolded here less than 24 hours earlier. Only the dark stains around my windows hinted at what had happened. The fire inspector was already there, taking photos. He nodded when he saw me. "We're documenting everything carefully," he said. "Especially access conditions." I didn't have to ask what he meant. Later that morning, I began gathering what I had, the emails I'd sent, the call log from the HOA office, and the videos neighbors had shared with me. I saved copies in multiple places. I wrote down the exact timeline from memory: when I noticed the cones, when I spoke to the volunteer, when I called emergency services. Putting it all on paper made it feel less like a blur and more like a sequence of preventable steps. Around noon, my phone rang. It was the HOA president. "We'd like to meet and discuss a resolution," he said carefully. I asked, "A resolution for what?" A pause. "For the situation yesterday." I agreed to meet at the clubhouse that afternoon. When I arrived, 3 board members were seated at a long table. Their tone was polite, controlled. They spoke about community spirit, unfortunate timing, how no one could have predicted a fire. I listened without interrupting. Then I placed my phone on the table and played one of the videos. The sirens. The shouting. The cones. The delay. No one spoke while it played. When it ended, I said calmly, "I told you emergency vehicles needed access. You ignored me." Their expressions shifted from defensive to uneasy. One of them asked, "What is it you're asking for?" I looked at them and realized this wasn't just about repairs or costs anymore. It was about accountability. And I wasn't going to let this be dismissed as an unfortunate accident. The room felt smaller after the video ended. No one reached for their coffee. No one shuffled papers. The only sound was the faint hum of the clubhouse air conditioner struggling against the afternoon heat. I watched their faces carefully. The confidence they had carried into this meeting was gone, replaced by something far more uncertain. One board member cleared his throat. "We understand your frustration." I shook my head gently. "This isn't frustration. This is evidence." I slid a folder across the table. Inside were printed screenshots of my emails, timestamps clearly visible. My call log. A written timeline of the day. Each page felt like a quiet statement that this wasn't emotional exaggeration. It was documented fact. The HOA president flipped through the pages slowly. His eyes paused at the time I had emailed that morning, warning them about emergency access. 9:14 a.m. The fire department report, which I had requested a copy of earlier, sat at the back of the folder. The section noting delayed access was highlighted. "Critical minutes lost due to obstruction in residential access point." He read that line twice. Silence settled again, heavier this time. Finally, one of them asked, "What would you like us to do?" I had thought about that question all morning. Not in anger, but in clarity. "I want this acknowledged in writing," I said. "I want the HOA to accept responsibility for blocking emergency access after being warned. And I want a formal rule added that no driveway in this community can ever be obstructed for events again." They exchanged glances. This wasn't the small, quiet resolution they had hoped for. This could expose the association to liability, someone said carefully. I met his eyes. "That's because there is liability. The truth hung between us, unavoidable." They asked for time to review the matter with legal counsel. I nodded. I wasn't in a rush anymore. The urgency had passed with the fire. What remained was patience and documentation. As I left the clubhouse, I noticed something new. A few neighbors were waiting outside. They had heard about the meeting. Word had spread quickly after the videos circulated through the community group chat. They didn't ask questions. They just said, "We saw what happened." And in their voices, I heard something powerful. Support. 2 days later, the email arrived. It wasn't long. It wasn't emotional. It was written in careful, legal language that tried to sound neutral while quietly admitting more than the HOA probably intended. They acknowledged that my driveway had been obstructed during the event. They acknowledged that I had raised concerns that morning. And they acknowledged that emergency vehicle access had been delayed as a result. I read it 3 times. Then I saved copies everywhere. By then, the story had moved beyond private conversations. Neighbors had shared the videos widely. People who hadn't even attended the fair had seen the footage of the fire truck struggling to pass through tents and cones. The community message board was filled with discussions about safety, responsibility, and how something so small had nearly become a tragedy. That afternoon, I attended the next HOA meeting. The room was full. More residents than I had ever seen before sat in the folding chairs, waiting quietly. The board members looked tense, aware that this was no longer routine business. When they opened the floor for discussion, I stood up, holding a printed copy of their email. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't accuse. I simply read their words aloud. Every acknowledgement. Every carefully phrased sentence. You could feel the shift in the room as people understood what had really happened. Not a random fire. Not unfortunate timing. A preventable delay caused by a decision that dismissed a homeowner's warning. When I finished reading, I added one sentence of my own. This is why driveways are not empty space. No one clapped. No one spoke immediately. But the silence carried understanding. A motion was raised from the audience to formalize a rule: no event, vendor, or gathering could ever obstruct residential access points again. The vote happened right there. Unanimous. I sat down, feeling a strange mix of exhaustion and relief. My house was still damaged. Repairs would take weeks. Insurance paperwork was ongoing. But something meaningful had already changed. This wouldn't happen to anyone else here again. And that mattered more than I expected. 3 weeks after the fire, I stood across the street and looked at my house as contractors moved in and out through the open front door. The black stains around the windows had been scrubbed away. Fresh primer covered the hallway walls where smoke had once curled along the ceiling. The air no longer smelled like ash. It smelled like paint, plaster, and slow recovery. What surprised me most was how normal the street felt again. Children rode bicycles past my driveway. Neighbors watered their lawns. Delivery trucks stopped briefly without blocking anything. Life had resumed its quiet rhythm, but there was a subtle difference now, an awareness that hadn't been there before. A new sign stood near the entrance of the community park where the fair had been held. Emergency access must remain clear at all times. I had seen it go up a few days earlier. No announcement. No ceremony. Just a quiet correction to a mistake that had almost cost far more than property damage. The HOA president stopped by that afternoon. He looked different than he had weeks ago, less authoritative, more reflective. "We've updated all event procedures," he told me. "What happened changed how we think about space." I nodded. Space isn't empty when someone might need it to survive. He didn't argue. After he left, I walked up my driveway slowly, noticing how clear and open it looked. It was strange how something so ordinary could now feel significant. I paused at the spot where the cones had once stood and tried to remember how small the issue had seemed that morning. Just for a few hours. Just for an event. Just some cones.
I unlocked my front door and stepped inside. The house felt different but familiar, like it had understood something and come back wiser. I realized I didn't feel angry anymore. What I felt was understanding of how quickly small dismissals can turn in serious consequences. Later the evening, I neighbor dropped off a plate of food and said, "Because of you, this place is safe now." I hadn't set out to change anything. I had only wanted my bravery left alone. But sometimes the smallest warnings are the ones that matter most, and sometimes it takes silence, smoke, and critical minutes for people to finally listen.